I knew something was terribly wrong the moment Victoria's glass slipped from her hand. One second she was laughing, sharing stories about her garden, and the next her words turned to nonsense, her eyes unfocused, her body unsteady. I felt a chill run down my spine, deeper than worry, heavier than fear. Then came the ambulance, the concerned voices, the quick rush to the hospital. But it wasn't until I reached that cold, white hospital room that the truth started to unfold. Strange looks from the doctors. Questions about my behavior. Whispers behind closed doors. And then, the discovery of something I knew I had never touched, hidden right inside my own purse. That's when I realized someone wanted me gone. Someone wanted me silenced. And I was going to find out exactly who. When you reach my age, people think life becomes smaller, quieter. Maybe it does for some. But at 68, life didn't get smaller for me. It got heavier. My name is Evelyn Brooks, and after my husband passed away 5 years ago, I became the steward of a legacy I never asked for. I inherited not just a house, not just land, but an empire. $5 million in oil royalties, real estate, and investments. It sounds like a blessing, doesn't it? To the outside world, I was a wealthy widow, living in a gorgeous estate on the edge of Oregon's green hills. But behind those polished windows, my life was anything but peaceful. My days were long, but I found comfort in routines. Mornings began with fresh coffee on the back porch, watching the birds flit between the old oaks that lined our property. Afternoons were for tending to my garden. My late husband loved roses, and I kept them alive for him. Evenings, though, belonged to Lucas. My grandson, my greatest joy. Lucas was only 9, but he had a heart bigger than anyone I knew. I picked him up from school most days, packed his lunches, helped with homework, and listened to his silly stories about playground adventures and science experiments gone wrong. He kept me grounded, reminded me that love was simple and pure, untainted by greed. His parents, on the other hand, well, that's another story. My son Mason was 35, and to be honest, I still didn't understand who he had become. I had loved him fiercely from the moment I first held him. But somewhere along the way, that sweet little boy had drifted into something far more complicated. Mason was spoiled, not just by wealth, but by excuses. Every failure in his life was someone else's fault. Every opportunity was never quite good enough. He hopped from one doomed business venture to another, squandering every chance I gave him. From organic restaurants that folded in months, to tech startups that never got off the ground. He burned through more money than I care to admit. I tried to teach him discipline to help him stand on his own, but every time I caved. Maybe because I blamed myself. Maybe because it was easier than listening to his guilt trips. Maybe because I still saw glimpses of the boy he once was. Then there was Chloe, my daughter-in-law. Young, strikingly beautiful with flawless blonde hair and a wardrobe that seemed curated from fashion magazines. She always greeted me with a smile, perfectly polite, but it never reached her eyes. Chloe had a way of making me feel like an intruder in my own family. Conversations with her were rehearsed robotic. Compliments sounded hollow. Every visit felt like an obligation on her part. She never spent time with Lucas the way I did. She never asked about my day or shared hers. Chloe existed in her own bubble. Expensive spa treatments, lavish shopping sprees, and endless brunches with her equally superficial friends. Still, I swallowed my pride for Lucas. I stayed quiet at family dinners, nodded along during Mason's rants about business opportunities, endured Chloe's passive-aggressive remarks about old-fashioned parenting because in the end I thought family is family. I told myself their faults didn't matter as long as Lucas was safe and loved. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered warnings I didn't want to hear. Mason had changed. Chloe had never been genuine. And the more time passed, the more isolated I felt in my own home, my own family. People often said I was lucky. $5 million, a beautiful estate, a healthy grandson. What more could I want? But those people didn't see the shadows creeping into my life. They didn't see the greed glinting in Mason's eyes during every financial conversation. They didn't feel the coldness in Chloe's perfectly practiced smile. They didn't hear the dismissive tones when I mentioned charity work or how Lucas brightened my days. I started spending more time volunteering, organizing charity drives, funding local animal shelters, and helping single mothers get back on their feet. It gave me purpose. It reminded me that money was meant to be shared, used to uplift, not hoarded. Lucas loved accompanying me to those places. His face would light up feeding the animals, helping other children, learning the importance of kindness. And every time I watched him, I told myself, maybe I didn't raise Mason right, but I wouldn't fail with Lucas. Life looked quiet from the outside, but I could feel the storm building. Behind the smiles, behind the family dinners, behind the polite exchanges, there was something festering. And it wouldn't stay hidden forever. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Mason arrived unannounced. I should have known then. Anytime Mason showed up without a phone call first, it was never just to check in on me. Still, I forced a smile as I opened the door, trying to hold on to a thread of maternal optimism. Maybe this time it was different. "Mornin', Mom," Mason said, leaning in for a quick half-hearted kiss on my cheek. He smelled of expensive cologne, his hair freshly styled, but there were dark circles under his eyes, and his smile didn't quite reach them. I invited him in, set a pot of coffee brewing, and we sat in the sunlit kitchen where the walls still bore the marks of Lucas's crayon adventures from years ago. We talked about the weather, about Lucas's school projects, about meaningless nothings, but the longer we danced around the small talk, the more obvious it became. He wasn't here for a casual visit. He was here because he wanted something. Finally, Mason leaned forward, elbows pressing into the kitchen table, fingers interlaced. "Mom, I've got a business opportunity." "A big one," he said. The way his voice shifted, rising persuasive, was a sound I'd grown far too familiar with over the years. I didn't say anything, just nodded for him to continue. "There's this investment group, real cutting-edge tech guys, expanding into green energy. I've got a chance to buy into it early," he explained. Words tumbling out quickly, practiced. "But I need capital. Just a little boost to get in before the initial round closes. I was hoping you could help me. Just $100,000. That's it. Small potatoes compared to everything you have." My stomach tightened. Here it was again. The same tired song with slightly different lyrics. I watched his face closely. His too eager smile, his bouncing knee, the way he avoided direct eye contact whenever I didn't immediately respond. I set my coffee cup down slowly. "Mason, you've already gone through how much of your trust fund? How many big opportunities have I bankrolled? And where has it gotten you?" His jaw clenched for a split second before he masked it with a forced chuckle. "This is different, Mom. It's a sure thing." I shook my head. "That's what you said about the meal delivery app, the health supplements, line the crypto venture. You don't need another cash injection. You need discipline. You need to stand on your own 2 feet. Mason's smile faltered. His face hardened. "It's always the same with you." He snapped, bitterness seeping through his tone. "You've got all this money, all this land, and you just sit on it like some self-righteous dragon while your own family drowns." I folded my arms, unwilling to flinch. "You're not drowning, Mason. You're mismanaging. You're running from responsibility, and it's Lucas who's watching every step you take. He needs a father who shows him how to build a life, not how to scheme for handouts." His fists balled tightly on the table. For a moment there was a glint in his eye that chilled me. A flash of something raw, something dangerous. He leaned in, voice dropping to a lower, sharper pitch. You think you're better than me, Mom? Sitting up here in this mansion like you're some saint? You think all your charity work makes you noble while your own son struggles? I met his glare, evenly unwilling to let guilt seep into my bones like it used to. I'm not responsible for your choices, Mason. And I won't fund another reckless dream while you ignore your son, your wife, your responsibilities. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then, just like that, Mason pushed his chair back abruptly, its legs scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Fine, he snapped. I'll figure it out myself. Don't come crying to me when you end up old and alone because that's what you've chosen. With that, he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I sat there for a while, my heart hammering against my chest. Not from sadness, but from the unsettling sense of finality in his words. Mason had always been impulsive, but this felt different. There was a calculation in his anger, a coldness I hadn't seen before. As I looked out the window, watching his expensive car speed down the driveway, kicking up gravel in his wake, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Not just for what he might do, but for what he might already be planning. It was only 3 days after that bitter conversation with Mason when the invitation came. Chloe called me mid-afternoon, her voice unnaturally chipper, coated in that syrupy tone she reserved for moments when she wanted something. "Evelyn," she said, "we've been meaning to have you over for dinner. Just a little family evening, something cozy. Mason thought it would be nice to reconnect, and we thought you could bring Lucas along too. Plus, my mom, Victoria, is visiting. It'll be good for all of us to have a relaxing evening together." I almost said no. My instincts were still raw from the confrontation with Mason. But then I thought of Lucas. His little eyes always lighting up at the thought of family dinners, his eagerness to spend time with his grandmother. I didn't want to make him feel caught in the middle of adult tensions. Besides, I told myself I was probably just being paranoid. Maybe Chloe was trying to smooth things over. Maybe this was a chance to reset. So I agreed. I even dressed nicely, put on a touch of my favorite lipstick, and told Lucas we'd go together. He beamed with excitement, clutching his favorite sketchbook, ready to show Grandma Chloe's fancy house his latest drawings. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting golden light across the manicured lawns of their modern villa. The air smelled of grilled steaks, fresh herbs, and something else. Something faintly metallic, I would later realize. Chloe greeted us at the door, radiating polished perfection in a sleek cream blouse and tailored skirt. Her smile stretched wide, but her eyes, they didn't crinkle at the corners. They were flat cold. "Come in, Evelyn," she chimed. "So glad you could make it." Victoria was already seated in the living room, chatting about flowers and retirement clubs. She seemed cheerful, genuinely pleased to see me, asking about Lucas's schooling, commenting on how tall he'd grown. Lucas, happy as ever, showed off his drawings, and I allowed myself for a brief moment to relax. Dinner was laid out beautifully. Roast beef, steamed vegetables, fresh bread rolls. The table gleamed with polished cutlery and crystal glasses. It should have felt welcoming, but something tugged at the back of my mind. Something artificial about the whole scene. Mason was overly attentive, topping up my plate before I'd even asked. Chloe, who usually didn't bother to make eye contact with me for more than a second, was suddenly all smiles, asking me about my garden, my charity work, complimenting my outfit. It was unsettling. Then came the wine. Chloe stood, her high heels clicking gently against the tiled floor, and returned from the kitchen holding a vintage-looking bottle of red wine. "I saved this for a special occasion," she said sweetly. "Thought tonight was perfect." I watched as she uncorked the bottle with practiced ease, pouring the deep crimson liquid into crystal wine glasses. She paused only briefly before placing the first glass directly in front of me, fingers lightly brushing the stem. "To family," she said, raising her own glass, her smile sharp as a knife. I instinctively glanced at the glass before me. The rich burgundy color was inviting, but then I noticed it, a faint haze swirling toward the bottom of the glass. My heart paused. I leaned in slightly and caught a subtle, unpleasant scent cutting through the wine's usual fragrance. Bitter almonds mixed with something chemical. My stomach tightened. It wasn't paranoia. It was experience. 30 years in and around courtrooms, hearing every trick, every deception, every story of quiet malice. I had smelled this before. In cases where a small dash of poison turned a glass of wine from hospitality into a death sentence. My expression stayed neutral. I forced a smile, nodding along with Chloe's toast, but inside my mind raced. Lucas was happily munching on his bread, unaware. Victoria was chatting about local markets. Mason was watching me closely, a little too closely, like a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. I made my decision in a flash. As Chloe turned to top off Mason's plate, I shifted my hand, lifting my glass and quietly switching it with the one nearest Victoria. A simple swap, done in a fluid, natural motion. Nobody noticed. Years of raising children and enduring corporate functions had given me the subtle grace of sleight of hand. I raised my glass in response. To family, I echoed, barely letting the rim touch my lips. Victoria, cheerful and oblivious, took a long sip from her new glass. Chloe smiled wider, satisfied, unaware that her own mother was now drinking what was meant for me. I felt sick. Not from the wine, but from the betrayal sitting right across the table smiling at me with teeth too white and eyes too hollow. Dinner carried on, but the air grew heavier. I could feel the weight of deception suffocating the room, thick like fog. I counted every minute, every bite, every glance Mason shot my way. I was no stranger to betrayal in the courtroom, but I never thought I'd feel it in my own family dining room. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I would be walking out of there as just a guest, or as a victim. It didn't take long after dinner before the change in Victoria became impossible to ignore. One moment she was cheerfully recounting a story about her garden club. The next, her words began slurring into jumbled nonsense. Her hands trembled as she reached for her glass, knocking over a side dish, her body swaying unnaturally in her seat. I felt my heart plummet to the pit of my stomach. Lucas's smile dropped into confused concern, while Mason jumped up from his chair, exclaiming in mock alarm, "Mom, are you all right?" Chloe was at her mother's side in a flash, face twisted into an exaggerated mask of panic, her hands fluttering around Victoria's shoulders. "I don't know what's happening to her," Chloe shrieked, her voice a little too loud, too performative. It was fine until she drank the wine. "Evelyn, what did you do?" My breath caught in my throat. There it was. The opening move, the accusation disguised as shock. I stood quickly, reaching for Victoria, who now looked pale and utterly confused. Her pupils dilated, words spilling out like scrambled puzzle pieces. Chloe fumbled for her phone with suspicious efficiency. "We need an ambulance," she cried. "My mother's having something. She's disoriented, confused. She's not herself." Lucas looked up at me, small eyes wide with fear, his hand gripping my sleeve. "Grandma, what's happening?" I wrapped my arms around him, shielding his small frame against my side. My mind, though, was racing faster than my heart could keep up. They didn't count on Victoria being the one to drink from the tainted glass. They didn't count on me noticing the switch in time. But they had a backup plan, one far more sinister. By the time the paramedics arrived, Victoria could barely hold herself upright. She babbled incoherently, stumbling over simple sentences, clutching her head in confusion. Chloe stayed glued to her side, feigning helplessness, while Mason hovered near the doorway, fingers twitching, stealing quick glances in my direction. At the hospital, it all happened so fast it made my head spin. Doctors rushed Victoria into a restricted unit while Chloe took control of the narrative. She spoke urgently to the attending physician, Dr. Audrey Mitchell, layering her words with just enough truth to make the lie believable. Earlier during dinner, Evelyn insisted on mixing a special drink. She wanted to elevate the flavor of the wine, Chloe whispered loud enough for me to hear. But ever since Victoria drank it, she's not right. It's like she's having a breakdown. She's not coherent. Doctor. Mitchell furrowed her brow, scribbling rapid notes as she listened. Mason stood nearby, arms crossed, occasionally shooting me cold, detached glances. I clenched my fists by my side, biting down the instinct to shout. There were no raised voices in hospitals. There were quiet traps, hidden daggers beneath civil words. Victoria's symptoms deteriorated rapidly under observation. Severe disorientation, memory gaps, and difficulty controlling motor functions. Dr. Mitchell mentioned neurological toxins as a possibility, pending toxicology reports. Chloe wept into Mason's shoulder, but there was no moisture in her eyes. I should have seen it coming. As the clock ticked deeper into the night, I excused myself to the restroom. My purse sat in the visitors' lounge where I had left it earlier, zipped shut and untouched. Or so I had assumed. Something gnawed at me, a quiet dread curling at the base of my spine. When I returned, I noticed the small shift. The zipper was off by just half an inch. Subtle, barely noticeable, but I knew. Years of being cautious with my belongings taught me to notice these small deviations. I sat down, heart-hammering, and slowly opened my bag. And there it was. A small, unlabeled medicine bottle, tucked beneath my wallet, wedged in next to my reading glasses. My breath seized. I hadn't seen it before. I hadn't placed it there. But it sat glaring up at me now, an undeniable piece of planted evidence. My jaw clenched as Chloe re-entered the room, wiping at her perfectly unsmudged makeup, blinking back her false tears. She leaned close to Dr. Mitchell, murmuring something about not wanting to cause trouble, but maybe we should check Evelyn's bag, just to be thorough. Minutes later, the inevitable happened. A security officer and Dr. Mitchell approached, apologetic but firm. Mrs. Brooks, would you mind if we check your personal belongings? Protocol, they said. I stood slowly, my chest burning. Of course, I replied coolly, because resistance would only make me look guilty. I watched silently as gloved hands rummaged through my things and discovered the vial with practiced shock. I don't understand. I managed to say, feigning confusion as my world cracked open around me. Doctor. Mitchell's tone shifted colder now, laced with professional detachment. With the evidence present and the correlation between the drink you provided and Victoria's current condition, we will need to file an incident report and notify law enforcement. Mason stepped forward, his face, the picture of righteous sorrow. Mom, I don't know what's happening with you lately, but this isn't right. Chloe placed a hand over her chest, shaking her head. We didn't want to believe it either, Doctor. Mitchell, but she's been acting unstable. The final nail came when an officer arrived to take my initial statement, quietly hinting at the possibility of mandatory psychological evaluation, at least until an investigation could be concluded. I could feel it all slipping through my fingers. My credibility, my freedom, my ability to fight back. I wasn't just being accused of poisoning someone. I was being painted as mentally unfit, dangerous even. They wanted me out of the picture. Institutionalized. Powerless. And judging by the glances being exchanged between Chloe and Mason, they thought they had succeeded. But as they escorted me to an observation room for evaluation, I kept one thing in mind. They had made one critical mistake. They left me breathing. And as long as I was breathing, this wasn't over. The cold white walls of the hospital room pressed in on me like a prison. I had seen many rooms like this before during my years in law, small, clinical, sterile. But I never imagined I'd be on this side of them. My wrists bore no cuffs, but my freedom had been ripped away by the people who should have protected me. My own son. My own family. It wasn't the confinement that hurt the most. It was the betrayal. I sat there, my heart hardened, wondering how far Mason had planned this. How long had they been plotting? Was it just the past few days, or had it been months, years even? Every moment that had seemed like simple disrespect, every missed call, every sarcastic comment. Was it just groundwork for this? The door creaked open, and a young nurse came in to take my vitals, looking at me like I was fragile, glass about to crack. I smiled at her out of habit, but inside I was building walls of steel. I wasn't going to be another sad story of a wealthy old woman tricked and discarded by her own flesh and blood. After she left, I paced the small room, the minutes stretching like hours. Then, finally, my phone vibrated. A number I knew well. Charles Bennett. My old friend, my colleague for over 3 decades, the one person who knew my mind better than anyone else. I picked up with trembling hands. Evelyn. I just heard Charles said, his voice steady, but charged with quiet fury. I don't believe a word of it. Tell me everything. I told him every detail. Mason's demand for money. Chloe's strange invitation, the wine, the switch, the sudden collapse of Victoria, and the conveniently found bottle in my bag. I didn't have to explain the rest. Charles understood the legal ramifications faster than I could speak. "You're not alone," Charles said firmly. "You have me. You have your record, your reputation, and your rights. They may have thought they won, but this fight is far from over." For the first time in hours, my shoulders eased. I was a prisoner in a hospital room, yes, but I wasn't defenseless. I had knowledge. I had the truth. And I had Charles. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A hidden message from Lucas. Sweet, precious Lucas. It was short-hurried, likely typed with little fingers beneath the dinner table. "Grandma, Daddy, and Chloe are always talking about fixing paperwork. They keep saying you're too old." Chloe said, "After this, Mason gets everything." "Are you okay? I miss you." Tears pricked at my eyes. Not from sadness, but from a deep-rooted protectiveness. Lucas was the only pure thing left in this tangled mess. I couldn't let him grow up thinking this kind of greed and deceit was normal. I couldn't let him believe his grandmother just disappeared without a fight. I thought back to a quiet day 3 months ago, sitting in my attorney's office. I had felt a gnawing discomfort about Mason's reckless spending, his indifference toward Lucas, his constant dependence on me. After long discussions, I had updated my will, something Mason never knew about. My estate had been revised so that the majority of my wealth would be transferred into the Brooks Family Foundation, a charitable trust focused on community programs and children's welfare. Mason, under the new arrangement, would receive only a modest stipend for his basic needs. The remainder would serve the world, not fuel his gambling or Chloe's designer addictions. That was the real motive. It wasn't about me being unstable. It wasn't about me being unfit. It was about that will. About those millions they had counted on suddenly slipping from their grasp. They wanted me declared incompetent so they could challenge the will in court, overturn it, and regain full access to the fortune. This wasn't just betrayal. It was theft, plain and simple, executed with the precision of seasoned criminals. But they underestimated me. I wasn't just a grieving widow. I was Evelyn Brooks, former prosecutor, lifelong fighter, and a mother who still had a few battles left in her. My confinement wasn't going to be a defeat. It was going to be my war room. By the time Dr. Mitchell came in to do her evening rounds, I had already called Charles back. We devised a strategy. He would file an emergency legal motion to request a psychiatric review from an independent court-appointed professional citing conflict of interest and potential elder abuse. Meanwhile, Charles would quietly begin pulling surveillance footage from my home, checking phone records and accessing Chloe and Mason's financial transactions. Anything that hinted at coercion, manipulation, or premeditation. He knew exactly where to dig. I stayed calm, cooperative with the medical staff, never raising my voice, never resisting. I knew better than to play into their narrative. I answered questions succinctly, requesting all sessions be documented and copied for my legal defense. Inside, I was already preparing for battle. Every word Mason and Chloe had uttered, every glance exchanged during dinners, every unexplained transaction. I replayed it all in my head, creating a mental case file. I wrote detailed notes on hospital napkins, smuggled them to Charles through the few visitors I was allowed. I kept Lucas's messages safely hidden in my pocket, tiny reminders of why I couldn't back down. Chloe and Mason thought I was trapped, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. They thought they had silenced me. They didn't realize. This was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the walls of my hospital room didn't seem quite so suffocating. My mind was no longer consumed by fear, but by quiet, methodical calculation. While the world outside thought I was a woman in decline, I was rallying my defenses piece by piece. Charles worked tirelessly, and within 48 hours he brought in Emily Carter, an old acquaintance of ours, and one of the sharpest private investigators in the state. Emily had made a career digging through lies, tracing hidden assets, and exposing secrets the privileged thought they could bury. If anyone could uncover the truth about Chloe, it was Emily. I waited anxiously for updates, passing each hour, meticulously documenting everything I remembered about the weeks leading up to my confinement. Then, finally, Charles called with the first breakthrough. His voice was calm, but beneath it I could hear the electricity of momentum. "Evelyn, Chloe isn't who she says she is," Charles told me. I held the phone tightly, heart hammering. "Go on." Her name wasn't Chloe Brooks 5 years ago. She legally changed it before moving to Oregon. Charles explained. Emily traced her back to 3 other states. Different last names, different stories. Every move was carefully timed. She has a sealed juvenile record and 2 arrests in her early 20s tied to credit card fraud and identity theft. My blood ran cold. It all made sense. The charm, the manipulation, the ease with which she had wormed her way into Mason's life. Chloe wasn't just a gold digger. She was a career predator. Charles continued. We also found bankruptcy filings under her old names, multiple civil lawsuits settled out of court, and a dismissed fraud charge in Nevada. Chloe knows how to cover her tracks, but not well enough for Emily. It wasn't just Chloe's past that was murky. The financial records Charles had subpoenaed revealed something even more sinister. Mason's accounts are bleeding, Charles said grimly. He's buried in over $200,000 of debt, mostly from sports betting and poker games. There are withdrawals flagged by his bank as suspicious and several payments made to known loan sharks connected to organized gambling rings. I closed my eyes, breathing through the sharp sting of betrayal. My son, my only child, not just reckless but criminally desperate. And here's where it gets worse, Charles added. Emily uncovered encrypted messages between Mason and Chloe. She's been encouraging him to go through with this scheme for months, pushing the idea that if you were declared incompetent, they could seize legal guardianship, take control of your estate, and rewrite your will. My stomach twisted. They hadn't just wanted me out of the way. They wanted to erase my voice, my decisions, my independence. They were counting on the legal system folding quickly, Charles said, painting you as senile, irrational, mentally unfit. Chloe even hinted to friends that you were slipping, laying groundwork for this. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. I'd spent decades defending the vulnerable from manipulation, and now I was living the very nightmare I had once fought against. Have we got enough to start countermeasures? I asked. Almost, Charles replied. We're building a solid case for fraud, coercion, and attempted theft. But we need to move smartly. I've brought in Grant Turner, a top defense lawyer with a reputation for ripping apart fabricated charges. You remember him from the Maxwell embezzlement case? I nodded, the weight in my chest lightening just a bit. Grant was relentless in court, and exactly who I needed. Charles's plan was clear. We would file a motion for an independent psychological evaluation challenge, the basis of my confinement, and introduce early evidence of financial misconduct on Chloe and Mason's part. It would be the first domino in toppling their scheme. But Charles wasn't stopping there. Emily continued digging, focusing on Chloe's network of old connections, tracking any accomplices or hidden assets. If there were skeletons in Chloe's closet, we were going to unearth every single one. Meanwhile, I remained the picture of calm compliance within the hospital. I didn't give the staff any reason to doubt my stability. I was courteous, rational, articulate. Everything Chloe's narrative tried to deny. At night, I replayed every conversation, every look Chloe had given me, every dismissive shrug from Mason. I remembered Lucas's confused questions about why his parents kept whispering about Grandma's money. I remembered how Mason's tone shifted over the last year from entitled to resentful, from frustrated to dangerous. And more than anything, I thought of Lucas. My sweet boy, too young to realize the web of greed his parents had spun around him. I refused to let him grow up learning those values. I refused to let this poisonous legacy pass through him. When Grant called the next morning, his voice was confident. We've filed the first motion. I expect you'll be out of there within days, Evelyn. But more importantly, we're going after them. This isn't just about getting you free. It's about making sure they answer for every ounce of harm they've caused. For the first time since this nightmare began, I allowed myself to smile. They thought they could silence me. They thought wrong. I had spent enough years in courtrooms to understand one universal truth. When greedy people panic, they make mistakes. And Mason and Chloe were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. It was Charles who helped me craft the idea, and Grant who signed off on it. We needed bait. Something irresistible. Something that would trigger their desperation and force them to show their true colors. And I knew exactly what would work. Money. Specifically, the illusion of a hidden document that could block their inheritance permanently. Through carefully controlled channels, we let slip that I had hidden certain financial records in my home. Records that supposedly detailed offshore accounts, revised trust agreements, and incriminating evidence of Chloe's past, all of which could be used to reinforce my will and make it legally untouchable. It didn't take long for the rumor to reach them. Charles had a contact within the county clerk's office, who casually mentioned to Chloe during a routine document request that Mrs. Brooks mentioned locking down her assets just last week, and that the original documents hadn't been filed yet but were secured at home. The bait was set, and I could practically hear the gears turning in Chloe's manipulative mind. Of course, we didn't leave anything to chance. Grant contacted federal authorities, and with the mounting evidence of elder abuse and financial coercion, the FBI agreed to assist. The case had evolved beyond a local dispute. It now included fraud, conspiracy, and possible criminal enterprise. Agent Emily Carter, who had been coordinating with Charles, brought in a discreet surveillance team to my estate. Every inch of my home was secured. Hidden cameras installed behind light fixtures, motion sensors embedded into common pathways, microphones planted in the dining room where I suspected Mason and Chloe would spend the most time searching. The entire property was wired to capture every move, every whispered word, every guilty glance. Meanwhile, I played the part of the confined, docile patient perfectly. When nurses asked how I was feeling, I smiled politely. When Mason visited to feign concern, I acted cordial but distant, knowing he was there to gauge how close I was to regaining control. But the sweetest moment came unexpectedly. One evening, my phone vibrated with a message from an encrypted app Charles had installed on my tablet. A message from Lucas. "Grandma," it read. "I heard Mom and Dad talking when they thought I was asleep. They said they have to go to your house and get some papers before anyone else finds them. Dad said if they don't, everything is ruined. Mom said they'll sneak in after your doctor signs something. Do you know what's happening?" My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a flood of emotions I could barely control. My sweet, innocent Lucas had unknowingly given me the final piece of the puzzle. Their plan wasn't just speculation. It was real. They intended to break into my home, retrieve, or more likely destroy, the very evidence they believed would strip them of any claim to my fortune. Lucas didn't understand the gravity of what he overheard, but I did. His message was the silent alarm that signaled it was time to strike back. I messaged Charles and Grant immediately, forwarding the text. Within the hour, Agent Carter coordinated the final preparations. A quiet team was stationed near my property, their vans disguised as utility vehicles, their presence invisible, but their surveillance active. The plan was simple. I would request a meeting with Dr. Mitchell the following morning to discuss early release options. Chloe and Mason would assume that meant my legal team was preparing to shut them out completely. Their window to act would shrink dramatically. Their panic would spike. As expected, the very next evening, Chloe and Mason made their move. It was just past midnight when the perimeter alarms, silent to them but loud to the FBI, triggered. The security feed streamed straight to a secure monitoring room where Agent Carter, Charles, and Grant watched the events unfold in real time. Mason used his spare key to quietly open the back door. Chloe followed, dressed in dark, inconspicuous clothes, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. They moved through my kitchen like they owned the place, whispering instructions to each other. Their voices captured clearly by the tiny microphones hidden beneath the cabinetry. "Check the study first," Mason hissed. "She always keeps her files there." Chloe rummaged through drawers, yanking open file cabinets, tossing papers onto the floor. Mason worked on prying open the safe I hadn't used in years, unaware that it now contained nothing but decades-old tax returns and a small dusty photo album from my honeymoon. "Where is it?" Chloe snapped, her mask of fake sweetness stripped away to reveal raw greed. She must have lied. "If we don't find it tonight, we're done." "We will find it," Mason growled. "I'm not walking away from $5 million. It wasn't just their words. It was the ease with which they discussed erasing my decisions, erasing my life's work, as if it was nothing more than a hurdle to their payday. They moved from room to room, ransacking every corner, growing increasingly frantic. At one point, Chloe even cursed at the portrait of me in the hallway, calling me a useless old woman who didn't know how to share. Their plan was to torch any records they found. Chloe had brought accelerant, thinking a quick accidental fire would erase any legal trace of my intentions. But they didn't realize every movement was recorded, every whisper documented, every step counted. The moment Mason tried to disable the camera in the study, thinking it was just part of my outdated home security system, the agents made their move. Within seconds, the front and back doors burst open. FBI jackets flooded in, agents barking orders. Mason's face paled as he raised his hands. Chloe dropped the duffel bag with a defeated shriek. Agent Carter's voice cut through the chaos. "Mason Brooks. Chloe. Brooks, you are under arrest for attempted fraud, elder abuse conspiracy, and breaking and entering. It was a moment I had envisioned many nights while lying awake in that hospital room. And now it had become reality. Charles called me minutes after the arrests were made. His voice carried the smallest smile. "They walked right into it, Evelyn," he said. "Exactly as you predicted." And I smiled, feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks: relief. The hunter had become the hunted, and I was just getting started. The morning after their arrests, my hospital room felt brighter. The sterile white walls no longer seemed to suffocate me. They were simply walls, no longer cages. For the first time in weeks, I breathed deeply, knowing the storm had finally broken, and it hadn't drowned me. It had drowned them. Charles called me before breakfast, his voice carrying an energy I hadn't heard in years. "Evelyn, it's done. They're both in federal custody. Charges have been filed." A small laugh escaped me, not out of happiness but out of sheer vindication. After weeks of being called delusional, of being painted as unstable, the truth had come out. And it came out spectacularly. Later that day, Doctor. Mitchell walked into my room, her professional mask still in place but noticeably softer. "Mrs. Brooks," she began, after reviewing the latest developments and consulting with legal authorities. "The hospital is terminating your psychiatric hold effective immediately. Your discharge papers are being processed." I didn't miss the way her tone shifted. Less clinical, more apologetic. I nodded, responding calmly, refusing to gloat. "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your professionalism." News traveled fast. Within 24 hours, the county prosecutor's office officially dismissed all charges and lifted every legal restriction that had been placed on me. The same prosecutor who had once labeled me potentially unstable now stood in front of reporters admitting that I was in fact the victim of an elaborate conspiracy. The video surveillance from my home made national headlines. Footage showed Mason and Chloe creeping through my estate in the dead of night, rifling through drawers, handling accelerants, whispering about erasing everything before the lawyers got there. Clear images of Chloe clutching the bottle of neurotoxin identical to the one planted in my purse sealed their fate. The footage was damning, but what made it inescapable were the audio recordings. Chloe cursing about my existence, Mason snarling about how she wouldn't need the money anyway. It wasn't just a failed burglary, it was a confession, a declaration of their intentions to destroy me for profit. Grant Turner stood beside me during the first press conference, his expression one of restrained triumph. My client Evelyn Brooks was the target of an attempted financial coup by her own family. Through careful investigation and cooperation with federal law enforcement, Mrs. Brooks has been fully exonerated. Mason and Chloe weren't just arrested. They were indicted on multiple felony charges: elder abuse, attempted financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud, breaking and entering and possession of illegal substances with intent to administer. The prosecutors were moving swiftly, determined to make an example out of them. What struck me most during those initial hearings wasn't Mason's sullen posture or Chloe's crocodile tears. It was the utter absence of remorse. Mason kept his eyes low, his shoulders hunched, but there was no shame, only anger at being caught. Chloe, even in her jail uniform, maintained her air of superiority as if this was just another minor inconvenience in her carefully calculated life. Back home, I walked through the front door for the first time in weeks. My house felt like mine again. Every photograph, every flower arrangement, every memory returned to me without the taint of fear. The FBI's sweep had removed every device Mason had planted, every trace of their intrusion scrubbed clean. I was no longer a prisoner in my own home. I was its rightful owner once more. Lucas was the first to greet me, running into my arms with the kind of pure, unconditional love that reminded me why I fought so hard. I hugged him tightly, feeling the small, steady heartbeat against my chest, vowing silently that no matter what happened next, I would protect this boy from the darkness his parents had tried to drown us both in. "I'm so glad you're home," Grandma Lucas whispered, his little hands gripping me tightly. "I missed you." "I missed you too, sweetheart," I whispered back. "And I'm not going anywhere." The press wanted interviews. Networks offered to buy exclusive rights to my story. True crime producers reached out eager to dramatize my ordeal. I declined every offer. This story wasn't for their profit. It was a chapter in my life meant to restore what Mason and Chloe tried to steal: my peace, my dignity, my role as Lucas's protector. As the first trial date approached, Grant kept me updated. Mason and Chloe's legal team scrambled to negotiate, but the evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors had no intention of offering leniency. Too many seniors had been manipulated, too many families torn apart by greed. The justice system was making it clear. This would not be tolerated. And as I sat in my quiet home sipping tea by the window where Lucas played in the yard, I realized something powerful. They had tried to erase me, but in the end they erased themselves. All their plotting, all their deceit, all their cruelty, it had led them to orange jumpsuits and steel bars. Me, I was free. Freer than I had felt in years. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters lined the hallway, cameras clicking as Mason and Chloe were led inside in handcuffs, their faces pale, their once polished appearances reduced to the standard issue orange of the county detention center. I sat quietly in the front row, Lucas's tiny hand clutching mine. He was too young to understand the full gravity of what was unfolding, but he understood one thing clearly. He was safe with me, and I wasn't going anywhere. When the opening statements began, the prosecution wasted no time laying out the chilling blueprint of betrayal. They described how Mason, drowning in debt from gambling and reckless business ventures, conspired with Chloe, whose very identity was built on a history of fraud, to have me declared mentally incompetent. Their plan was crystal clear: secure guardianship, seize control of my estate, rewrite my will, and silence me. Each piece of evidence was meticulously presented. Surveillance footage showed Mason and Chloe ransacking my home. Audio recordings captured their whispered confessions about getting rid of the old woman and fixing the paperwork. Financial records detailed Mason's staggering debts, tracing wire transfers to shady bookkeepers and unregistered lenders. Chloe's prior legal troubles, once hidden beneath forged identities, were exposed, revealing a decade-long trail of manipulation and theft across multiple states. But what broke the courtroom's composure was Victoria's testimony. Victoria Palmer, now recovered enough to attend, walked to the witness stand with the quiet dignity of a woman who had been used and discarded by her own daughter. She spoke softly but firmly, describing that evening's dinner, the strange taste of the wine, the rapid deterioration of her senses, and the dawning realization that the poisoned glass had been meant for me, not her. When the prosecutor asked if I had ever behaved irrationally or dangerously toward her, Victoria's response was swift. "Evelyn Brooks has always treated me with kindness and respect," she said. "The only people I feared in that house were my own daughter and Mason Brooks." Her words sent ripples through the courtroom. I blinked back tears, not just from vindication, but from the heavy sorrow of seeing how far Chloe had fallen. The defense tried to claw back any semblance of sympathy, but their efforts were feeble at best. They argued stress, mental fatigue, misunderstanding. But the jury was unmoved. The evidence was a tidal wave they couldn't swim against. Lucas remained by my side throughout. The court had granted me temporary guardianship while the proceedings unfolded, but after hearing the full case, the family court judge expedited the custody hearing. The ruling was clear: Lucas would remain with me permanently. His best interests, the judge said, were not with parents who viewed family as currency. After the final verdict was read, guilty on all counts, I sat alone in my study that evening, reflecting on the journey that had led me to that moment. For weeks, I had been treated like a criminal. For months, Mason and Chloe had plotted to destroy me. For years, I had been naive about their true characters. Not anymore. The next morning, I met with Charles and my estate attorney. I signed a new will, one that brought me an unfamiliar but profound sense of peace. The Brooks Foundation for Children and Seniors was officially created. The bulk of my estate, every last cent of the $5 million Mason and Chloe had been so desperate to steal, would go toward scholarships for underprivileged youth shelters for abandoned children, community centers for the elderly, and healthcare initiatives for those most forgotten by society. Lucas's future was secured too. A dedicated trust ensured his education would be fully funded, his needs provided for, and that he would be raised in an environment of kindness, humility, and service, values his parents had tragically abandoned. As I signed the final document, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My wealth would no longer be a prize for the greedy. It would be a tool for good, a legacy of compassion rather than exploitation. Lucas sat across from me doodling superheroes in his notebook, unaware of the magnitude of the moment. I smiled, watching him, realizing that despite all I had endured, I had won the battle that mattered most. Not the battle for money. The battle for dignity. For justice. For the future. Months passed, and with every sunrise I felt a little more whole again. Chloe received the harshest sentence possible. Decades behind bars for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted poisoning. Mason, though given a slightly lighter sentence, would spend many years reflecting on his choices from the confines of a prison cell. Neither of them would ever see a single dime of the fortune they so viciously chased. The courts had made that perfectly clear. For me, freedom tasted sweeter than ever before. I returned to my home not as a broken widow, not as a victim, but as a woman who had fought for her dignity and won. The estate no longer felt like a gilded cage. It was my sanctuary, my safe haven, and most importantly, Lucas's home. We settled into a simple rhythm. Mornings began with fresh orange juice on the porch, the Oregon sun casting golden warmth over our little corner of peace. Lucas would sit beside me sometimes, drawing, sometimes reading, sometimes simply resting his head on my shoulder while we watched the world awaken. His transformation was what healed me most. Without the toxic influence of Mason and Chloe, Lucas blossomed. His curiosity returned, his laughter became louder, his kindness more evident. He took joy in the little things, helping me tend to my garden, feeding stray animals that sometimes wandered near the property, organizing his own mini charity drives with the neighborhood kids. One afternoon, we volunteered together at a community shelter funded by the Brooks Foundation. Lucas helped serve meals to children his own age who hadn't been as fortunate. I watched as he sat with them, shared stories, made them laugh. That moment was the most profound pride I'd ever felt. Not because of money, not because of the family name, but because I could see I was raising a boy who would grow into a man of integrity. Evenings were our quiet time. After dinner, we would curl up in the living room with books or old movies. Sometimes, Lucas would ask about his parents, and I never lied to him. I told him people sometimes lose their way when they let greed cloud their hearts. But I always reminded him he was different. He could choose his own path. He didn't have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Every Sunday, we'd visit the Foundation's programs. Schools we funded, shelters, we supported healthcare clinics we built. Lucas saw firsthand where the money went. He saw the impact his family's legacy was creating, and he understood something Mason and Chloe never could. True wealth isn't measured by what you keep, but by what you give. As the years rolled by, Lucas flourished into a young man I was honored to call my grandson. I attended his high school graduation, beaming with pride as he spoke about justice, kindness, and responsibility. When he earned his scholarship not from privilege, but from merit, I clapped the loudest. When he volunteered his summer breaks to build homes for families in need, I smiled, knowing the Brooks legacy had finally found its rightful purpose. One quiet evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset melt into the horizon, Lucas turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Grandma, do you ever wish things had turned out differently?" I sipped my tea. Heartful. No, sweetheart. Life gave me a choice: to drown in betrayal or to rise above it. I chose peace. I chose purpose. And I chose you. He nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. "You saved me, Grandma." I placed my hand gently over his. "No, darling. We saved each other." I had learned the hardest lesson in the gentlest way. Family isn't built on bloodlines or shared DNA. It's built on loyalty, compassion, and love. My journey wasn't just about reclaiming my freedom or protecting my wealth. It was about planting the seeds for a better future, nurturing the next generation to be stronger, kinder, and wiser. And as Lucas stood taller, kinder, and more thoughtful with each passing year, I knew I had done exactly that. I had broken the cycle of greed. I had restored dignity, not just for myself, but for the name I carried and the boy I loved. As I watched the golden sky fade into twilight, I felt nothing but gratitude. I wasn't just free. I was fulfilled. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to reflect. Have you ever witnessed someone you love lose their way to greed? Or perhaps you've experienced the quiet strength it takes to protect your dignity when others try to take advantage of you. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your story matters too. And if you believe in the power of standing up for yourself with grace and quiet determination, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story of resilience, justice, and family redemption. Thank you for being here with us. And remember, sometimes the greatest revenge is peace.